I had no idea about crush syndrome. And so like you see these images of what happens in Syria, right? The building comes down and six hours later, people are just throwing the rubble out and they get this kid out. And you see the image of getting the kid out and it's like, oh, good, they got the kid out. But now after I've learned about crush syndrome, and I'm like, oh, how and when they remove the debris and the medical staff that have to go in there to make sure crush syndrome doesn't cause a life-threatening issue. For our listeners, there's going to be a lot of listeners on here who have no idea what crush syndrome is. Can you explain? So we talked about Widowmaker. Again, for Widowmaker, for the people, it's basically the concrete that is hanging off the rebar that they're just waiting for it to fall onto the rubble pile, right? But then there's the other component of you have to be meticulous. It takes a lot of time to actually remove the rubble. What is crush syndrome?
So a mechanical manifestation, also known as rhabdomyolysis, basically a cell being crushed, potassium and calcium switching sides, the need to try and get those two chemicals alone replaced back to where they originally needed to be. And then what we know as the muscle hemoglobin, known as myoglobin, a very large cell within our body, need to be excreted. And because of the length of time that you're without hydration within that rubble pile, i.e. if it happened at 1:30 in the morning, crush manifestations can happen as short as 3 to 4 hours. And so could he have already had rhabdomyolysis settings, of course, just on time manifestation, if he was unable to move, had weight on top of large muscle masses. And that's where they look at that coming from. Those cells deteriorate. They immediately begin they're dead, they're dying off. There's a lot of ramifications from those, what they call free radicals, now floating in the system and causing other damages and death in other tissues. But particularly with that muscle cell, that myoglobin, and a change in pH levels because lack of hydration, lack of movement tends to plug our kidney system, our loop of Henle. And so we find ourselves being saved from the rubble and living for 1 or 2 days, however, dying within those period of time at the hospital. It started, the science came out of the UK during the London blitzkrieg during World War II, when the Germans were bombing the buildings in London. The victims were being brought out of the rubble, taken to local emergency rooms, and a doctor by the name of Bywaters said, "Why do we have so many British citizens reaching the hospitals alive, but dying within 2 days of being there?" And so began the study of crush syndrome, actual what they call mechanical crush syndrome, and crush manifestations, depending on the type of wording you want to use. So crush mechanical would be the actual weight of something being on that person and causing that, and or the person themselves, if they're unable to move in a kneeling position, they've got heavy weight on top of their shoulders and they can't go anywhere from the floor, and they're stuck there for several hours. The pressure that's on the back of their hamstrings, the back of their calves, the back of their shoulders are large enough muscle masses to create certain damages within the body itself, even death if it's not treated aggressively. And so on the medical side, they try to do what's known as they try to return that patient to his or her pre-entrapped status. So how were they before the initial disaster happened? And we'd like to get them back to that state before it happens. And if we can reverse crush or anything like that, we're probably going to save a life.